The topic of religion as a force in world affairs is a capacious topic. It is worth a weekend, it's worth a semester, indeed it's worth a decade. And so we ought to be modest about our expectations because we've set the boundaries so broadly. I happen to know personally many of the speakers you will hear this weekend, and I know others by reputation, and that gives me confidence because I know what they know in depth, and therefore I thought I had the easier task, namely to try and frame this large, dynamic, burgeoning question, to frame it broadly, and then let the experts take over in depth. So if the question is religion as a force in world affairs, and if my specific topic is religion, world politics, and U.S. foreign policy, I will try to ask and to some degree answer three questions. Where have we been on this issue? Secondly, where are we now? And thirdly, where might we go on the question of religion, world politics, and American foreign policy? The we here is everyone at this conference, Americans as citizens, and inevitably, in a globalized world, the we extends out beyond our national boundaries because this nation touches so many others by the way we decide, by the way we succeed, or by the way we fail. Before I get to the three questions, let me say a word of commentary. This question of religion, world politics, and U.S. foreign policy is usually described these days in terms of the title of a recent book called The Resurgence of Religion. The term resurgence connotes the idea of absence and then return. There is indeed some truth to this conception of an absence of religion in both the discussion of world politics and American foreign policy, but that sense of absence needs to be qualified. Religion has certainly been part of people's personal lives in continuity without break. Religious communities globally and nationally have been present, vibrant or less vibrant, but there. And religion has been a force in world affairs, but perhaps the topic that brings us together is that it is a force that has been unaccounted for. Therefore, the topic of the resurgence of religion is less about what one of my Harvard colleagues has called lived religion, the way people live it on the ground. It's less about that. The resurgence is about how religion and world politics and American foreign policy has been understood analytically and taught, and how it has been practiced in the diplomatic world. In those two arenas, intellectual and political, it is right to talk about an absence and a return. Let me bring to bear upon my reflections the voices of others. Professor Robert Keohane, late of Harvard, Duke, and now at Princeton, Keohane is universally respected as one of the most informed assessors of the state of international relations, teaching, and scholarship in the United States. Keohane said the following: "The attacks of September 11th reveal that all mainstream theories of world politics are relentlessly secular with respect to motivation. They ignore the impact of religion, despite the fact that world-shaking political movements have so often been fueled by religious fervor." End quote. Yesterday, my foreign affairs for this quarter arrived in my mailbox, and part of the journal is an article by Professor Thomas Farr, Farr, recently retired from the State Department and now at Georgetown. In an article precisely on the role of religion in world politics, Farr says the following, quote, "The United States is a religious nation, but neither scholars of U.S. foreign policy nor its practitioners have taken religion very seriously," end quote. So it is appropriate to talk about absence and return, at least at important levels where the politics of the world are debated, discussed, taught, and practiced. So let me begin on that note with the question, where have we been? A short run through a long history. The canonical way to get at this question of religion and world politics is to invoke what is called variously the Westphalian legacy of world politics. That legacy is over 400 years old. The kind of generalization that I am making, that I could synthetically say something about 400 years, is what makes historians wince. But I have a time limit, and therefore, of necessity, I have to ascend to generalities. Westphalia was both a treaty, formed in the 17th century, 1648, that brought to an end the religious wars in Europe. But Westphalia has also been a tradition of intellectual discourse, of looking at how we should analyze and understand world politics. The Westphalian tradition, I submit, has been comprised by three component elements. First, the world is a world of sovereign states that acknowledge no higher authority. Secondly, the basic rule that should govern sovereign state relationships is non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states. And thirdly, the Westphalian tradition implicitly, more than explicitly, I would argue, set out to secularize international relations. It is understandable why that might have happened. The religious wars of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries wiped out a third of the population of Central Europe. And so it is not surprising that diplomats of the time would have been convinced that it was best to wall off religious conviction from the already complicated world of international interstate politics. So I think it is true that Westphalia tried to take religion out of the world of war and politics. And the diplomats were complemented in their efforts by moralists. One of the outstanding political moralists of the 16th century was a Spanish Dominican named Francisco Vitoria. And Vitoria said, religion is not a cause for war, not a justified cause for war. So in that sense, Vitoria himself, priest that he was, theologian that he was, tried to work with the diplomats to take religion out of the world of war and politics. This beginning phase of the Westphalian tradition was deepened from another channel. In the 18th century, the democratic revolutions in France and the United States took another step. We are indebted to those revolutions for the formulation of what we today understand to be the full understanding of the right of religious freedom. But the other side of the coin was that the democratic revolutions, on the whole, again perhaps more implicitly rather than explicitly, also set out to privatize religion. The argument, therefore, is that religion is indeed important and valuable to individuals, and indeed the right to religious liberty should protect the person's right to search out God as they see fit. But the personal value of religion was not to be complemented by a large public role. The public role for religion was to be, again, walled off from the political process. The Westphalian tradition, I submit, has been quite effective in different ways. The two basic principles of state sovereignty and non-intervention were organizing principles in the 1940s at the time of the founding of the United Nations. But the absence of religion was also effectively there. Its lack as having any role in the United Nations or since then is quite evident. Within the discipline of world politics, the teaching of world politics, there's nothing like numbers to bring home a point. Let me cite to you what I would call canonical texts, major, leading, classical texts in the theory of world politics. Raymond Aron, the great French theorist of world politics, in his 800-page book, Peace and War, devotes 3 pages to religion. Hans Morgenthau, the founding father of the discipline of international relations in the United States, devotes 10 pages to his 600-page work. Ken Waltz, the dominant theorist of international relations over the last 20 years, has no reference to religion whatsoever. And a book that is widely used today called The Globalization of World Politics, which runs about 600 pages. If you look at the index, it talks about religion and terrorism in 3 pages. So it is clear that Westphalia has been effective on many fronts. And to some degree, I, for one, am grateful to the Westphalian tradition for many reasons. But the fact of the matter is, on the topic before us tonight, the question is whether we can sustain, in a linear fashion, keeping up with the Westphalian conception that religion doesn't make any difference. Let me turn to the question of whether you can keep up that pattern of reasoning in the face of 2 different things: events on the ground and changing ideas about world politics. It is the intersection of these 2 things, I submit, that gives rise to the discussion about a renewed presence, a necessary renewed presence of religion in world politics. At least that is now the argument. The beginning of this story, which goes back roughly about 40 years, 30 years at most, perhaps, is events on the ground. Just remember the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Religion in Latin America and Central America in the 1970s and 80s. Religion as a force of resistance to Pinochet in Chile, to the Brazilian generals in Brazil. Religion as a transitional force preserving peace and ousting a dictator who ran a crooked election in the Philippines, Marcos. Religion as an extraordinarily valuable force in the transition in South Africa to majority rule. Religion embodied in the personality of Archbishop Tutu. And the role of Lutherans in Berlin and a Polish Pope in coordination with solidarity, leading in part to the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern and Central Europe. These were the events which indicated that if you had no understanding of religion as a public force, you would have almost no way to do a good briefing on the events. But there was the need to move from event to themes, to thematic analysis, because each of these events, running from 1979 till about 1991, each of these events, I submit, were regarded as significant in themselves, but in terms of how world politics and international relations were analyzed and understood, each of the events, I think, were treated anecdotally. That is to say, they were surprising, perhaps amazing, interesting, but there was no connecting of the dots among them to raise larger thematic questions, to ask about the need of a change of perspective in the Westphalian formula. Indeed, once again, Thomas Farr's article, recounting partly his experience in the State Department, makes the point that in 1999, a memorandum was prepared for the Secretary of State on religion, and as Farr puts it, a senior official in the department sent the message back down to the author that religion was not an appropriate subject for analysis. But there was a need to move beyond anecdotes and singular events to thematic interpretation. Moreover, the resurgence of religion did not occur in isolation from other features of world politics. There were broader intellectual trends which facilitated or catalyzed interest in the religious factor as a force in world politics. 3 different externalities, if you will, to religion were all taking place thematically in world politics. Again, in the late 1960s and on through the rest of the century, there was in the study of world politics the rise of transnationality, the argument that in addition to sovereign states, there were other forces at work in world politics that one had to understand in order to understand the world. Among those transnational forces were what were called transnational actors. Transnational actors are based in one place, present in several places. They have a trained corps of personnel, a single guiding philosophy, and a sophisticated communication system. That's IBM, Phillips Petroleum, the World Bank, and the Jesuits. And therefore, it is the comparative characteristics, the comparative advantage of transnational actors to be able to move ideas, resources, personnel across the borders of international politics. Transnationality came into its own in the latter third of the 20th century. Secondly, from the late 60s on to our own day, there is the journey from interdependence to globalization. Multiple ties across borders, material ties for sure, but not just material ties, highlight the presence of institutions who are already there, moving across borders daily, and among those institutions are the great religious traditions. And then thirdly, there was the return of normative discourse in world politics. The end of World War II is usually regarded as the triumph of the realist school in the study of world politics. And the realist school was always skeptical about normative analysis. Not even religious analysis at that time, but ethical analysis. But again, if you track the events from the mid-70s on to our own time, the rise of human rights, the struggle about what to do about nuclear weapons, and the struggle about a globe growing ever more unequal for vast numbers of people, and the question of justice as a theme that needs to be analyzed as much as the dynamic of the market. These thematic ideas, normative in content, raised questions about where one would go to find normative resources. Religion was not the only place to go, but it was unavoidably one of the places one would want to go to assess these kinds of questions. So you go from facts on the ground to broader themes that surround the question of religion and world politics, and then you begin to crystallize the argument. And here, two more nodal points are useful. Sam Huntington's article on the clash of civilizations in 1994, and then, of course, the tragic events of 9/11. Huntington's article, which appeared in Foreign Affairs in 1994, called The Clash of Civilizations. The article, in retrospect, I think, is significant as much for who wrote it as for what he said. The Huntington article did not create a consensus around what he said, but Sam Huntington was an icon of the standard interpretation of international relations and world politics. Always a controversial figure, but widely respected by his critics and his followers for whatever he said. In fact, Huntington in the 1970s had already caught the sense that religion was making a difference as he articulated his theory of the third wave of democratization in the 20th century and highlighted the role of religious communities in terms of the support given to human rights causes. But this article in 1994 was different than his argument about the third wave of democratization. It was a deeper challenge to the way one understood world politics and a proposal of a very different order. He argued that the future of world politics would move away from interstate relations to internationalization across civilizations rather than states. As I said, Huntington did not create a consensus behind this proposition. The article drew enormous attention, critique, and response, not consensus, but what it did was to create space and legitimacy for the explicit thematic ongoing analysis of the role of religion in world politics. Indeed, people who studied religion professionally had great difficulty with Sam Huntington's definition of religion and how it related to culture and how it related to civilization. But my point is, you have this kind of figure who has been a lodestone for the interpretation of world politics, saying you can't ignore these factors anymore, whether you agree with the way I have formulated them or not. And then, 7 years after the Huntington article, the 9/11 event. Emblazoned on the front page of The Economist was the phrase, "the day the world changed." The statement itself cries out for assessment. Did everything change or some things change? We debate that till today. But the impact of the event was universal in its significance. Sam Huntington did not claim that he had predicted it, nor that there was any necessary linkage between his article and what was done. But then others entered the analysis. What should we do with religious claims in world politics? By the first decade of a new century, what had been presumed to be absent, religion, was now clearly on the table. Where are we now? The analytical lens. Again, the focus is on the academy, on the diplomatic world, but it is equally on the focus of the minds of the general public, how we think about this dynamic interaction of religion, politics, sovereignty, intervention, war and peace, justice and inequality. The present task, I submit, is to move from recognition of the fact of religion as a force in world politics to the integration of that reality into our larger scheme of understanding the world. The task is both conceptual and bureaucratic. That is to say, how we understand and how we operate in the world of diplomacy and policy. The integration. Let me begin with 3 don'ts. Do not do the following. Do not define religion primarily as a negative force or solely as a negative force. The inclination after 9/11 moved in that direction. Do not define it as what must be defeated, banished, or marginalized. There are negative consequences and negative possibilities when religion interacts with politics. That story is as old as Western civilization. But the negative consequences are one dimension of the story. The positive possibilities of explicitly relating religion and politics are at least as important. It is not clear to me what the balance is in the long term, but a definition of it in purely negative terms will get us off on the wrong track. Secondly, do not define religion exclusively as a focus on Islam. There is an urgency, to be sure, to understand Islam, but the process underway, of which I refer to, the return of religion, was underway before 9/11, and for multiple reasons, Islam should never be excluded or ignored, but it is not the topic of the return of religion and international politics. Thirdly, do not define religion in the United States as exclusively the work of evangelicals or fundamentalists. The evangelical community is an important, significant force in American public life, and it is not easily summarized. Not everyone thinks the same way. And it has been a significant force on issues like Darfur and AIDS. But it is one dimension of the larger picture of religion in American society and American foreign policy. Beyond the don'ts, a constructive proposition. The dimension of the constructive task, I submit, is similar to what Huntington did, but less definitive in its predictions than he was. The constructive task of how you put religion together with foreign policy and international relations is going to require a systematic assessment of the role of religion throughout the international system. And having made a systematic assessment of multiple traditions, multiple modes of engagement, multiple consequences, good and evil, then we begin to deal with how the normative relates to the empirical dimensions of international relations. We need to take stock, then we need to relate major secular theories of international relations to how one understands the role of religion. As we do this, we face a challenge, and the challenge of how you look at this question, I think, is the challenge of relating to it either functionally or foundationally. That is to say, there is much interest today in religion as a functional force in world politics. And social science, by definition, studies functional forces. And foreign policy requires that we do so. But keeping religion at the functional level without foundational assessment of how these great religious traditions put together the elements of their intellectual heritage, their meaning and ritual, and their sense of their public life is absolutely necessary. It is an interdisciplinary task in which no one commands all that is needed. The functional is natural and necessary to social science, but it leaves out too much in this picture to look at it only that way. There is, I think, an analogy that preceded us in the last 40 years in the study of world politics that might be helpful. Around the end of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, the classical distinction in the way we used to study foreign policy used to be described as high politics and low politics. High politics was war and politics. Low politics was international economics. In the late 60s and early 70s, the proposal was increasingly made that high politics should be both war and politics and wealth. In other words, low politics was looking for a status of equality. Through a series of significant intellectual studies at the time, space was created so that high politics, in its definition, was expanded. This meant a broadening of the conception of what constituted international relations. It meant understanding that there was a different logic to the interaction of states and people in war and politics and wealth and politics. War and politics, by definition, is a zero-sum game. There are winners and losers. But in political economy, there can be winners and winners, losers and losers, or some win and some lose. A different logic, a different dynamic. Space was created over a period of 20 years, so the study of world politics today is different than it was even as late as the mid-1960s. Creating space for analysis of a new factor is precisely the task we confront today. Only it is the religious factor that requires some space on the board at this time. How much space and how to relate it is a very delicate question. For myself, in getting ready for today, I used parts of a new book called The Resurgence of Religion and the Resurgence of Religion and the Transformation of International Relations by Scott Thomas. It is a very good read in the parts I've used. But at times, I think he may claim too much. It is one thing to say you need to integrate religion into the larger framework. It's another, at times, it looks as though he thinks the whole framework has to be transformed. For myself, it's a step too far. How do you locate religion on the map of world politics? I go back to transnationality. If transnational actors are fundamental to the study of international relations, one way to locate religion is to think of the great religious traditions as, in fact, transnational actors. They have a different comparative advantage, obviously, from economic and other actors, but they have a place that is similar. Then you could proceed from locating it to begin to look at the basic elements that religion brings into the political process. I would submit here, in very general terms, that major religious traditions always bring three things to the political process, domestically or internationally: ideas, institutions, and communities. Ideas, conceptions of meaning, definitions which cut across issues of life and death, ways of relating religious knowledge to secular knowledge. Religion can expand people's imagination, expand their hearts and their charity, and religion can tell people to kill people. So we need to understand what the ideas are that are out there. Institutions. Religious communities are transnational religious institutions within states and across states. They are present at every level of the international system. But finally, it is communities of people that religion always brings to the table. People who are both believers and citizens of the time and world in which they live. There's a lot more that needs to be said, but not within my time limit. So let me turn to my final question. Where might we go with this question of religion and world politics, and specifically religion and U.S. foreign policy? My focus here is U.S. foreign policy, and to some degree the emphasis is on a question Jim Matlock asked me to say something about: religion and the use of force. But first, religion and U.S. foreign policy. There is a way in which we need to confront what I would call the constitutional question here. The U.S. Constitution makes foreign policy professionals often hesitant to address this issue openly and explicitly and consistently as a matter of normal policy analysis. Again, Professor Farr, most analysts lack the vocabulary and the imagination to fashion remedies that draw on religion, a shortcoming common to all major schools of foreign policy. In addition to a hesitancy to address it, there is what I would call the difference principle. The difference principle, what I mean by that here is the following. For me, it's a hypothesis that stands in need of empirical evidence, but I will offer the hypothesis. That is to say, the better you understand the U.S. model of religion and politics, where we have a pervasively religious country, but a rigorously structured differentiation of religion and politics. The better you understand that model, my hypothesis is, it may be the less likely we are able to understand how other people put together religion and politics. We are not as secular as France. We are different than Britain in our practice, and we are very different than Arabia in its conception of religion and politics. So we need to hold on to what we believe and practice, but in taking it abroad, there needs to be the necessary transition. The task of integration. Previously, I've defined this as intellectual and bureaucratic. Here, some stress on the bureaucratic dimension for U.S. foreign policy. That is to say, not only how we understand this question, but how we operationalize it. Once again, we have a case study. The journey of human rights in U.S. foreign policy may be an example of how to deal with religion and foreign policy. Initially, in the early 1970s, when people pressed the issue of human rights, there was intellectual resistance to the idea from some. Henry Kissinger notably felt it was not a good idea at all to introduce and press human rights in the foreign policy process. And bureaucratically, even when human rights was placed on the table as a major policy issue, bureaucratically, it was often isolated in the bureaucratic process. And once again, the possibility that religion would suffer the same fate means that we need to learn from how difficult it is to decide something's intellectually necessary if you don't follow through bureaucratically and operationalize access for the question. Moreover, we need to look at the range of issues in which religion is significant. Religious freedom is certainly one, but I submit, as important as it is for the United States to press religious freedom, that is too narrow a conception of the role of religion in world politics. I would like to put religion on the table and look at cognate issues, issues similar to it, but not identical. So religion and human rights, for religious freedom is one of the human rights. Religion, development, and globalization. The religious traditions are among the most significant actors, particularly in nations that have a difficult time dealing with the pace and power of globalization. They often create the safety nets, and sometimes they create the reaction to a globalization pushed too fast and too far on fragile societies. Religion and humanitarian relief. Religious organizations often are there before any secular organization is. And the question of how you put those two together and keep the boundaries of church and state for both the religious communities and the state are important. Let me turn finally to the question of the use of force and religion. This is an old question. The debate here is 1,500 years old. It has a complicated history, but there are new dimensions to it today. So I submit that when you talk about religion, foreign policy, and force today, there is the dimension that I will call restraint and direction of force. That's the old question, the ethics of war. But today there is another dimension, conflict prevention and recovery from force, often called peace building. Let me start with the latter for a moment. Conflict prevention and recovery from war. Religious communities are actively involved in this question, and their active involvement has also spawned serious intellectual work at several places. I know of the work at Notre Dame, and I know of the work at the Institute of Peace, and I know of the work that Doug Johnson has done. All of these places are trying to give intellectual foundation to what is already an ongoing effort to try to prevent the outbreak of violence. So religion here cuts across preventive diplomacy and peace building. Communities of religious conviction are on the ground to address issues ranging from emergency relief to social justice to ethnic and communal conflict and mediation in those conflicts. Indeed, one of the primary articulators of the ethic of war, Michael Walzer, has coined the phrase jus post bellum. The classical phrases are jus ad bellum, jus in bello, now jus post bellum. What responsibility nations and others have after the war is over? That's an integral conception of what you undertake when you undertake war. But then to go back to the classical question, legitimation, direction, and restraint of force, ethics and war. This has been the traditional task with an ancient history and multiple responses. Some religious traditions saw only the task of refusing to participate in war. But the dominant tradition, sometimes called just war, has argued that the religious tradition ought to try to direct the use of force, if you will, direct it morally. That is to say, to legitimate some uses of force in the name of preventing injustice, but always to set limits and direction for it. This today has relevance across the board for the multiple forms of conflict we face. Particularly when great powers are involved, the conflict prevention part is harder to do. Contrast the scenes of the 1990s, internal conflict, where conflict resolution and peace building have been very, very important. It is harder when it's the great powers at the table of the Security Council and they're geared up for war. Then the question becomes, if it is going to come, how do you set limits to it? Here, I think we are at really a quite historic moment in the evolution of the tradition of the ethics of war. It again is a moment that has an analogous example. Between the 15th and the 18th century, the transition to the Westphalian order was also a time, of course, in which the Reformation had split the Christian church apart. And so three great figures, Francisco Vitoria in Spain, Francisco Suarez in Spain, and Hugo Grotius in Holland, two Catholics and a Protestant, who had written on the question of war for their lifetime, were convinced that you no longer had a religious foundation and you had to create a moral foundation that people could talk across religious lines to set limits on the use of force. Today, the challenge is much greater. We are not talking about what was previously a single coherent tradition that we are now trying to, in a sense, repair. We are talking about how we talk about across the great lines of the religious traditions in a globalized world. The empirical and the religious picture is far more complicated. But it is possible to do. In this kind of effort, you never try to get total agreement. You try to find the nodal points, the arteries, if you will, that carry the bloodstream of this argument. So let me say that we should try to find agreement on the legitimate causes of war, following Vittoria and keeping religion out of them. Secondly, we could agree on non-combatant immunity, that war is always tragic, but not everybody is to be subjected to the horrors of it. And we could address ourselves to the roots, the meaning, and the limits that terrorism must be enfolded within, limits that are firm, decisive, for this kind of war always focuses on the civilians. This will take secular religious collaboration. We are again at the question of integration of the insights of a 1,500-year tradition, but now facing a much more complicated world. Raymond Aron, at the end of World War II, said, "For the first time in history, we have a truly global international system." That was only the beginning of it. That was before interdependence, before globalization. That was even at the outset of the nuclear age. So today, as we think about the resurgence, the return of religion, it returns to a world of enormous complexity, empirically, religiously, and morally. But precisely because of the empirical and moral complexity, I think the proposition on the table is that one can ill afford what it is that the religious tradition has to offer with others to how we shape this world. Thank you.